Welcome back, everybody, to CMN 153. This is our class for Thursday, and we are talking about movies. Probably one of the most significant media vehicles that exists in our society in terms of its social and cultural impact. And while many of you had indicated that perhaps books and magazines and newspapers aren't that part of your life, I suspect that movies have been in one way or another. And when we think about the modern blockbuster film, probably Star Wars in 1977 comes to mind as the film where people were literally standing for blocks and blocks and blocks. It really changed the way that we approach cinema with a lot of fanfare and a lot of special effects. That said, when we think about the impact of movies in terms of its media influence, they can either affirm or they can deviate from our viewer and our societal values. So this is a way that we can either reinforce our cultural attitudes, or this is a way where we can perhaps break some taboos in a rather safe way. So, I've indicated that I teach a class in horror film, and that's exactly what we talk about, is that horror film allows individuals to break and deviate from societal expectations. Movie theaters also offer this local communal experience, in some ways almost much like watching a drama in the early days of drama, but on a much wider scale because of the ability for movies to distribute themselves across the globe, basically. In fact, many people have said that the United States' biggest cultural export happens to be its movies and its entertainment industry when you think about cultural imperialism. But what I wanted to do is tell you a little bit about the history of movies, and then actually have you view a movie, which you may or may not have seen thus far, and talk a little bit about the experience of viewing it. In terms of the history of movies, really it begins in the 1800s, when photos were manipulated to appear to move on a screen. And in the late 1800s, this is where we get celluloid. Photos that were put on thin strips of transparent plastic. They were able to be projected. This was also the time where single-person viewing systems came into play. And then in the early 1900s, there were projection systems for multiple viewers simultaneously, so everyone could experience the same movie at the same time. These were known as Nickelodeons. And one of the most famous movies that was viewed in the early days of Nickelodeon was basically an ocean, waves rolling from a beach. And in fact, it was so realistic to the viewers that were watching it, they actually stepped back, afraid that the waves might actually hit them as they were viewing. Also in the early days of movies, 1915, which is around the time that the movie industry is beginning to become a huge force in the business world, an actor by the name of Mary Pickford. And she was unusual because there were very few actors who could make these demands, and certainly as a female, that also was somewhat unusual, where she stated that she couldn't afford to work for $10,000 a week. She needed much more than that. As we know, the film industry has been very male-centric since then, but she helped to launch United Artists, which was one of the major studio systems up until the 1950s. And we've seen this played out over and over again, that once business interests have taken a hold, then we begin getting oligopolies and perhaps even monopolies, and then there's been a legal push to break that up. 1915 is usually the date that's given for the first feature-length film, entitled Birth of a Nation, an extremely racist and problematic film that glorified the Ku Klux Klan. And again, that film very much illustrates the cultural attitudes, the racism that existed during that time period. That said, it was also the beginning of the idea of narrative films, where films could do more than just show a visual of, let's say, an ocean breaking across a beach, and could now tell stories. And this is where we begin to get genres and categories of films that begin to target particular demographics. The 1920s is where these huge movie palaces were built, so everyone could experience this communal film together, and it oftentimes was a place where people would go to be seen. They were oftentimes like major opera houses. They were very opulent. They also provided things like air conditioning by being able to wet sheets down and have fans hit those sheets. So it was a place to escape the summer heat, and in fact movie theaters still exist in that way, particularly if someone is having difficulty with their cooling systems. In the 1930s is where we start getting talkies. And of course, that changed the movie industry from silent films, where oftentimes there would be a live piano player in the movie palace to provide some sort of a musical score, to now the 1930s, where you are able to record sound not just from actors but also soundtracks as well. In the 1950s, movie theaters faced a major threat to their existence with the advent of television. And as we've seen many other media vehicles do, they had to adapt. One of the ways that they could adapt was by differentiating their content from television, which was geared towards a more general audience. So at this point, films could focus on more risque material that would not necessarily be appropriate for viewing in let's say, a living room. That ultimately led to a rating system for the film industry as well. The 1970s was particularly interesting for film because this is where we get the transition from the deification of the actor to the deification of the director. And if you think about some powerhouse directors in our own time period, and I've listed just a few in our notes, the Lucas, Spielberg, Tarantino group, where oftentimes films are sold based on the director oftentimes being male and Caucasian. So the film industry has had lots of difficulties in terms of being able to be inclusive for all voices. And if film is our storyteller, then ultimately we are not listening to all of the stories of all of the people in our populace. The 1980s is where you get the height of the suburban multiplexes, that you no longer have these individual movie palaces, but movies have become something for mass consumption on a large scale and oftentimes associated with shopping malls. And 1980s was also the height of the shopping mall movement. But as we know, the 1990s brought in not only the internet, but it allowed video sales of first VHS tapes and then ultimately DVDs, which led to home viewing and completely transformed the movie experience. And that led to a lot of movie theaters really struggling, and they began to see a descent in their sales, particularly once we got into the 2000s. And then in the 2000s, what we saw was media convergence, as we found with so many other media vehicles, that the ability to stream and the ability to watch via internet, that led to the ending of video rentals and significantly impacted video sales. Blockbuster Video is probably one of the best examples of someone that had, or a corporation that had a stronghold in the market, and that no longer exists. So in terms of films, there are lots of films that we could talk about that have had cultural impact in our society. I had started by mentioning Star Wars, that really ushered in the idea of the modern blockbuster. We could talk about something like The Birth of a Nation, and that as our first feature-length film, as well as that as a lens into the discrimination and racism in our society. What I wanted to focus on in terms of film was a film you may or may not have heard of, Citizen Kane. And one of the reasons why I wanted to focus on this particular film is because it oftentimes is ranked on best film lists as the best film ever made. For instance, the American Film Institute would list Citizen Kane as the best film ever made. And Citizen Kane is related to what we were talking about in our radio section when we were talking about Orson Welles. So this is a nice connection between the two. And if you don't know anything at all about the story of Citizen Kane, there is a documentary of about 10 or 15 minutes that talks a little bit about the story behind Citizen Kane, and I've included that link. The difficulty with it is that it does give away the ending, so spoiler alert. You may actually want to watch the film first and then watch the documentary if you want to be surprised and you've never seen Citizen Kane. And basically, the story behind Citizen Kane continues after the War of the World broadcast with Orson Welles, where after being chastised for creating a public hysteria, instead of having to face legal repercussions, he was given a movie contract in Hollywood, and a rather unheard of, where he was given basically a complete creative license. And what he ended up doing finally was writing a movie and directing a movie and starring in a movie about Citizen Kane, a fictional character who was pretty obviously based on William Randolph Hearst, a name that I've mentioned before as well, because he really was the Rupert Murdoch of his day, and that he owned so many media outlets and had so much power in terms of media. William Randolph Hearst was an incredibly powerful individual and did not take kindly to this portrayal of him in this supposedly fictional film, Citizen Kane. And he did everything he could in his power to bring the film down and to bring Orson Welles down, and basically was able to blacklist Orson Welles from the movie industry. So that was basically Orson Welles' last major accomplishment. After that, he had a very difficult time in the industry, as you can see with the documentary. And of course, Orson Welles was very young at the time, in his 20s, so he peaked at a very young time, and basically the rest is descent and descent, which is very ironically similar to the story that we are told of Citizen Kane. And Citizen Kane happens to be about a media mogul, somebody who buys a newspaper. So this also is a film about media, as well as a film about newspapers, as well as a film about somebody who's very powerful in the media industry. Again, the Rupert Murdoch of his day, and that would be William Randolph Hearst. But it's directly related to Orson Welles and the way that he took risks. This time, this risk did not end up helping his career at all. And also related to the idea of cinema, because when you talk to scholars of cinema, they oftentimes identify Citizen Kane as an incredibly important film, not just in terms of its storytelling. And when you watch the film, you'll see that it's a narrative embedded within a narrative embedded within a narrative. But also in terms of its cinematography, where many people say that it was decades ahead of its time and helped to establish much of the cinematography that we take for granted nowadays. Special effects like aging characters, things like having characters who ultimately are having voiceovers with one another, so that you've got overlapping dialogue. You've got things like deep focus shots, so that everything appears in the image at the same time, so there's lots to analyze in terms of the visuals. Even something as simple as having a ceiling appear in a shot, which we take for granted, was very difficult technically during that time period. So there are lots of reasons why perhaps Citizen Kane has been listed by so many people as perhaps the best film ever made. If you've seen it before, you may understand why. If you've never seen it before, you may not necessarily understand why. I can tell you the first time that I saw that particular film, it was my freshman year in college, and I really didn't understand why it was considered to be such a great film until years afterwards, when I began to learn more about what was happening with the cinematography and what was happening with the storytelling. Now, if we were meeting in class, I would be showing you this particular film. I went on the internet and it wasn't particularly easy to find a version of this particular film. I was able to find something, and I hope that these links still continue to work. They do have some French subtitles, which is rather odd, but these are 4 separate links that broke the film up into 4 separate pieces because the film is rather lengthy. It's close to 2 hours. And then at the very last link, it also includes some still images of the filming, which you are free to watch, but you don't necessarily have to. But I would like you to watch the film. Some of you may perhaps own this film or have access to this film through some streaming service and would prefer to view it that way, and I encourage you to do that if you prefer. But basically, this is going to be our attendance question because I'm very curious to hear, after your experience of viewing the film, do you think this film is worth all of the accolades that it has received in terms of being considered perhaps the best film ever made? Again, it's the kind of question that's subjective. You don't have to necessarily create a right or a wrong answer. It's more about your argumentation. So I hope you enjoy Citizen Kane, I should say. I can tell you that over the years, it's become one of my favorite films, perhaps my favorite film of all films. So I hope you're well. I'm doing well. Get some popcorn if necessary, and set aside a couple of hours for Citizen Kane. Take care. Bye-bye.